Hi everyone, and welcome to the opening module for our class, Genocide Education. This week, I'll introduce some of the conceptual vocabulary that we'll be using this semester. Here are the learning objectives for the week. I use these to organize my video lectures in accordance with the readings. You can use these as prompts for our discussion forum. Okay, so let's dive in. To begin, I want to dispel the comforting yet misleading myth that genocide is somehow a strictly foreign problem, that it has nothing to do with the United States. This foreign gaze of genocide, as I'll call it later, is rejected by Reading 1 this week, which is authored by Indigenous scholar and education specialist Eve Tuck, who introduces us to the concept of settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is distinguished from other forms of colonialism by its population economy. Settlers come to stay. Contrast, for example, the British colonization of, say, India or Egypt with that of North America or Australia. When the British Empire left Asia and Africa, they didn't leave behind a massive, self-reproducing political community that displaced the natives, unlike what happened here or in Australia, where indigenous peoples have been almost entirely supplanted by non-indigenous settlers and migrants. Settler colonial societies are thus said to be characterized by a logic of elimination, which is a concept that I talk about in some of my other classes, so I don't want to dwell on this point for too long, apart from observing how the education system in settler colonial societies has historically been weaponized as an instrument in the logic of elimination. The first of our recommended readings here, which is authored by another indigenous scholar specializing in education, reviews this ignominious history. Beginning in the late 19th century, indigenous children were taken from their families and forced into boarding schools, where the goal was to kill the Indian, save the man. This infamous quote was from the superintendent of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, a notorious institution that's right here in Pennsylvania, by the way, only a few hours' drive from the Gratz campus. I say this in order to stress the presence of settler colonialism as well as genocide, right here at home. The key lesson here is that we should beware of othering in the study of genocide. That is to say, we mustn't assume that only the baddies commit genocide, not the goodies. Indeed, there's a tendency to moralize Holocaust and genocide education in such a way that it ethically distances students from the deeper implications of the problems at hand. I've thus recommended this other reading by a specialist in genocide prevention, who points out that if history is any record to go by, then genocides will continue to occur because perpetrators see it as a high-risk, potentially high-reward strategy in a world where impunity has been the rule rather than the exception. I'd argue that this record of impunity includes our own historical record right here at home. So the point is that genocide education begins at home, with a cold, long, hard, sober look in the collective mirror of society. The fact is, genocide has happened here before, so it can happen again. Thus, genocide prevention is a fundamental rationale for teaching about genocide in North America. Let me say a few words about the Genocide Prevention Framework, which is introduced by the aforementioned recommended reading James Waller, who uses a river analogy to illustrate different prevention strategies. For instance, the upstream category includes risk factors that exist prior to genocide, i.e., the conditions in which genocide become likely. Strategies deployed at this stage occur before violence reaches a tipping point, which is what distinguishes the midstream category. The sort of strategies envisioned at the midstream category include, but are not limited to, humanitarian and/or military intervention. Finally, the downstream category occurs after the fact. This includes a whole gamut of institutions and procedures associated with transitional justice. I'll return to this framework in week 4 when we cover the related but distinct approach to education and conflict prevention. But as far as this week is concerned, considering the presence of genocide, there is legitimate reason to apply a risk analysis against ourselves. That's what this book does here, which is also included in our recommended readings. The author, Alex Hinton, recounts his classroom experience teaching about genocide prevention in the context of the horrifying displays at the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. This is quite a gripping read on multiple levels. For one thing, it offers valuable lessons about the praxis of critical pedagogy, theory and practice combined. Secondly, it employs a very broad and expansive reading of the genocide concept, which I'll talk about later. And finally, like I said, it applies a risk analysis framework to the US. We see a number of relevant risk factors, or variables that increase the likelihood for genocide and related forms of mass violence. For example, and I've already touched upon this, prior history is a notable risk factor. Many cases of genocide are committed by repeat offenders, and climates of impunity, defined as a failure to punish past offenses, only breeds further violence. So that's the real risk here at home, and this is what I mean by introducing the problem of genocide education in North America. So, the fundamental rationale for genocide education is genocide prevention. This brings us to required reading 2, which is an analysis of Theodor Adorno's famous 1966 essay, Education After Auschwitz. Adorno was the famous Jewish-German intellectual associated with the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, and who lived in exile during the Nazi years and returned much later to post-war West Germany. As our reading explains, Adorno was writing and speaking as part of a recruitment drive to make up for a teacher shortage in West Germany in the mid-1960s. This effort sought to overcome the stigma of educators as disciplinarians, as well as of schooling as an inherently violent institution that enabled the Nazis' co-optation of the education sector. Adorno's previous work argued that certain psychological predispositions for authoritarianism were symptomatic of larger social structures. So here he was extending this critical theory to the education sector, arguing that the risk for the recurrence of genocide lurks right beneath the surface, hidden from view but nevertheless pervasive. Again, I won't tire of saying this. The key point here is that genocide prevention is a key rationale for genocide education. This essay also underscores the importance of critique and critical thinking. As it is generally used in critical theory, to critique is to disturb taken-for-granted truths and question so-called common sense. It's not about being fundamentally contrarian. Rather, it's about historicizing and rendering contingent certain claims about our social world that are otherwise assumed to be natural and/or universal. To critique is part of a larger set of overlapping dispositions and capabilities that are associated with critical thinking, which, for example, includes the capacity for critical self-reflection. This involves an awareness of one's positionality and standpoint, as well as a process of unlearning the ideological, social, and material mechanisms that lead individuals to be manipulated. I'll come back to this point later about guarding against manipulation. Now, a critical yet underappreciated aspect of critical thinking is its affective dimension in terms of emotional learning. Many people, including myself, before I started preparing this course, naively and incorrectly assume that emotions are a barrier to critical thinking. On the contrary, the act of critical thinking in fact requires a certain level of emotional intelligence. This is something you all can help me unpack. How does emotion relate to critical thinking? And towards the end of the essay, the author of Reading 2 suggests that critical thinking can cultivate certain emotions, for example empathy, compassion, solidarity, as antidotes to growing fascist tendencies around the world. What do you think of this? At the same time, however, the author warns us to avoid what Adorno called a kitsch sentimentality. I already likewise warned us against thinking about genocide in overtly moralized terms, as if only the baddies commit genocide, not the goodies. I'm foreshadowing a critique of the overt moralism hidden in the endnotes of Reading 3, but before I get to that later in the presentation, it's necessary to highlight the merits of this article, which again reiterates the intrinsic connection between genocide education and genocide prevention. The author, a former professor at the National Defense University, recounts the creation of a course on mass atrocity prevention that was specially designed for practitioners in the national security and intelligence sectors. This is a crucial reminder that genocide education isn't just for ordinary grade level or college students. And considering the advanced skill sets of this highly professional constituency, it's noteworthy that the author also suggests that educators should consider incorporating simulation exercises into the syllabus, which very much bucks the trend in Holocaust education that strongly urges against the use of pedagogical simulations. We'll talk more about that in week 7, when I return to this idea of rethinking the role of simulations, primarily in the policy-oriented terms of prevention. So more on that later. But our focus this week is on concepts, and this reading offers a broader and more inclusive perspective that isn't limited to genocide, in the strict and narrow sense of the word. On the contrary, the author frames the problem in terms of genocide and mass atrocity. This semantic expansion has been a common strategy in the prevention community as a response to the conceptual limitations of genocide, as defined by international law. So rather than getting stuck on genocide, mass atrocities acts as a sort of conceptual umbrella, covering a range of other acts that don't necessarily qualify as genocide, per se. Additionally, the author also references the aforementioned stream or river metaphor, distinguishing between the upstream period before mass violence and the downstream and its aftermath. although the focus is very much on the former, with special emphasis on teaching precursor diagnostic and reporting skills. That is to say, the author wants to train reports officers and intelligence and national security to recognize the warning signs for genocide and notify their superiors before the situation gets worse. The whole idea of upstream prevention is to stop genocide from happening. Waiting for genocide to happen first kind of defeats the purpose. The author makes this point on page 60, as they explain that their proposed course is, quote, not intended to teach students how to meet a prosecutorial threshold of proof that an atrocity will occur. Indeed, I think we all agree that hopefully such atrocities won't occur. But the idea isn't to sit around and wait for that to happen. By then it's too late. Thus, the author continues, the goal is to recognize early warning signals and transmit the observations to senior-level decision-makers when conditions may be favorable for an atrocity to occur. I cannot stress how important this is in terms of prevention, because if we wait for a situation to cross the threshold, then prevention is a moot point. Again, the whole idea of prevention is to stop genocide before it happens. That's the key point here. Now, before I go on, I want to draw your attention to how I've defined genocide as intentional group destruction. That's an oversimplification of the Genocide Convention, I admit, but as far as I'm concerned, genocide is the more or less intentional destruction of a group. As far as the definition is concerned, that's a good starting point. Still, what does that mean, the intentional destruction of a group? Some of you all may have already seen this slide in another one of my courses. It basically breaks down the conceptual elements of genocide. I'll briefly skim through each of these, and I can elaborate on the discussion forum, but I don't want us to get too bogged down in the weeds here. But with that said, what is it that genocides kill? Genocide is the destruction of a genos. It's the root word of genocide that refers to the targeted group. And as you can see here, there's a spectrum of possible ways in which such groups are conceived. Likewise, the side, or side element, essentially translates as to kill, but this part of the concept includes a whole range of potential acts. Likewise, the intent element is especially tricky, as lawyers in the courtroom remain beholden to a stricter, more specific standard, whereas the upstream perspective of genocide prevention should favor the broader, more general understanding of genocidal intent. Finally, mereology is the study of parts in relation to the wholes they form. So, how much of a group needs to be destroyed in order to qualify as genocide? Again, I don't want us to spend too much time on any of this, although I'd be happy to elaborate. Instead, I want us to focus on the broader cultural knowledge that's working in the background when the average person thinks of the keyword genocide, especially as it is so closely related to the Holocaust. I've shared this image as well in a previous course. It's from the Google Books Ngram viewer, and it measures the relative frequency of keywords over time. As you can see, our vocabulary words have a relatively recent genealogy. I'll elaborate this when I come back to this graph next week, when we discuss historiography. But for now, I just want to focus on the complicated relationship between these two key words. This is covered here in yet another recommended reading. I'll elaborate this point next week, but genocide was originally conceived as a generic concept. It wasn't specific to the Jewish experience, but deliberately included non-Jewish victims of the Nazis as well. Yet since the end of the 20th century, the quote-unquote common sense meaning of genocide has been based on the Holocaust prototype, either tacitly or explicitly. That's what's meant here by this question about which concept should be prioritized, which one defines the other. Hint, that's a trick question, by the way. Again, I'll talk more about this next week, vis-a-vis the bifurcation between Holocaust studies and quote-unquote other genocides. Additionally, next week I'll further discuss the historiographical debate over the significance of Holocaust memory. Simply put, proponents of the uniqueness thesis stress the sacred, totemic status of the Holocaust that defies, or at the very least tempers, comparison to other historical events, whereas proponents of cosmopolitan memory advocate the universalization of Holocaust memory as a cultural foundation for global human rights. This is grossly oversimplifying things, but check out this next supplemental reading for more. Anyways, the key point here is to understand how broader forms of cultural memory serve to influence our conceptualizations of genocide and related forms of mass violence. Actually, it's a reciprocal relationship here between our perceptions of history on the one hand and conceptions of genocide on the other. After all, we need an informed understanding of the past in order to see things in the present. However, I'm afraid this tends to become a one-way street, as our cultural knowledge of genocide is very often tacitly underpinned by the misleading assumption that the Holocaust is the single prototype. The Holocaust has thus become a crude sort of measuring stick, used to judge all other cases of genocide. This is the topic of reading 4. I'm especially concerned with the section under this subtitle, from pages 33 to 37, which describes how American journalists and policymakers use the Holocaust analogy to clumsily identify the genocides in Cambodia, Bosnia, and Rwanda. Later on in the article, the author highlights the problem with using this as an unreasonably high threshold for inclusion. After all, the Holocaust was particular in so many ways that it can't really serve as a standard for generalization. It's worth mentioning, by the way, that the author of Reading 4 is none other than Samantha Power, whose high-profile but complicated career in the Obama administration was preceded by her award-winning book on America and Genocide. In one of my other presentations, I remark upon the symbolism of this cover image, with those eyes peering through the window blinds, as if they're looking for genocide to happen somewhere out there, in the world beyond the supposedly safe domestic confines of our nation-state. Now, this is really ancillary to our present discussion, but I refer to this as the foreign gaze of genocide, or the widely taken for granted assumption that genocide is a foreign policy issue. That's something that other people do, not Americans. The foreign gaze is a function of denialism that obscures the deeper implications of genocide in the modern world, including right here at home. Recall our opening learning objective about the presence of genocide. Anyways, back to the point at hand, which is about using the Holocaust analogy to identify genocide. Generally speaking, the use of historical analogies is very common in political and public discourses. There is, after all, an important cognitive function to analogical reasoning, which is defined here as drawing parallels between a past event and a current situation. Historical analogies are cognitive shortcuts that effectively anchor unfamiliar situations in more familiar terms. What that means is that, when faced with an uncertain situation, it's reasonable to make inferential judgments based on previous experience, or even the quote-unquote lessons of history. Past events provide familiar frames of reference that may provide a coherent picture of the current situation, thereby reducing uncertainty. By appealing to historical truth, whatever that is presumed to mean, analogical reasoning also serves a rhetorical function as a means of persuasion. So, historical analogies serve both cognitive and instrumental ends. This, in turn, leads to the pitfalls of historical analogizing. For one thing, the so-called lessons of history are often based on superficial readings of the past, in which causal relationships are often overdetermined. For example, appeasement in Munich led to the gas chambers at Auschwitz. It's obviously not that simple, but that hasn't stopped many from using these sources to analogize for whatever reason. Likewise, overly simplified historical analogies often evoke an overtly moralized cast of characters, which, when cast in terms of the Holocaust prototype, the perpetrators, a la the Nazis, are fundamentally evil. The victims, i.e. the Jews, are fundamentally innocent, and the rest of the world, the Allied powers, are fundamentally good but tragically indifferent. This is basically the standard script that sets the background to A Problem from Hell. So, I want to push back against this standard script that we've inherited from our broader cultural knowledge that informs the Holocaust prototype-based concept of genocide. This includes the occasional tendency to use Auschwitz as a metonym, not just for the Holocaust as a whole, but for genocides as well. I'd venture to say that most people's somewhat to severely limited knowledge of genocide is more or less anchored in a general understanding, at best, of the Holocaust. Although, as we'll discuss next week, even that's a bit of a stretch. I don't know how much faith I have in the broader public. But anyways, I'm directing our focus towards what some social scientists call the social imaginary. This refers to the everyday language, the common set of background assumptions about reality, the myths, the legends, and the like that make up a society. Yet another one of our recommended readings uses this concept to explore a cultural understanding of genocide, or the repertoire of images, facts, themes, and stories that provide an intuitive understanding of, quote-unquote, what genocide is, or what it's supposed to look like. The Holocaust thus serves a familiar frame, a prepackaged schemata of interpretation that enables us to make sense of what is assumed to be the crime of crimes. Now, here you see the iconography of genocide, a familiar set of images that fit into pre-existing scripts, or morality tales with a likewise familiar cast of characters. So if we back up a bit to my earlier promise of reading 3's critique, it's worth highlighting the incidental connection behind a random endnote which references the website of Invisible Children, an NGO responsible for Kony 2012, a documentary film and social media campaign that was criticized, among other things, for its overt moralism and highly caricaturized account of mass violence in Central Africa. Images such as this, with the ghost of Hitler, which in this case is the source of the historical analogy, looming right over the shoulder of Joseph Kony, who in this case was the target of the analogy. And just in case you needed to know how bad this guy is, Osama bin Laden is thrown in there for good measure. Now, recall how Reading 2 urges critical thinking as a counteractive against manipulation. The word of warning here is about the risk for emotional manipulation through well-intentioned but malinformed and misguided propaganda. A genocide education steeped in critical thinking should be able to unpack this pre-existing social knowledge that tacitly informs our ability to make sense of reality. Now, to such ends, one possible exercise that teachers can use at the beginning of a course or module on genocide is a cluster or mind map. Here's an example of a mind map that's inspired by yet another recommended reading this week. So the instructions are simple. Have a student write the term genocide in the center of a piece of paper. Circle it, and draw spokes from circles to related terms or ideas. For example, start with prior examples. What cases are students familiar with? Another spoke leads to definition. What does genocide mean? Yet another spoke points towards the implications or consequences of genocide. It's recommended, but by no means necessary, to break out into groups for students to compare and amend their mind maps. The primary purpose of this exercise is to assess students' prior knowledge, helping both the instructor and student recognize what they may, or more crucially, may not already know about the subject. You can even ask students to reference possible sources of their prior knowledge, like have they read a book or seen a movie about any of these topics. That's what's going on here in the parentheses, as I asked the respondent for this example to list their sources of knowledge, including the news and mass media. This is just an interesting twist on this exercise, thinking about the possibility of generating some data for social analysis, for example. There's also something to be said about the general exercise of writing notes this ways, which allows for organizing thoughts from simpler to more complex forms. Practically speaking, you may also want the students to come back to these maps over the course of the semester or module and expand upon it as they gain new knowledge. Alright, finally, I want to discuss Reading 5 this week, which warns against educators acting as gatekeepers in genocide studies. Who among us presumes to have the power to determine who or what counts? That's always going to be an issue when teaching about genocide. Invariably, the question will arise, was this or that case genocide? Is it genocide? Is it genocide? That's kind of the wrong question to start with, for reasons that I won't get into now. But the author is warning us against presuming to have the authority to police the supposed boundaries of the field, deciding who or what gets to be included in the genocide studies canon, and who or what should remain excluded. The author reminds us as well that no one is above the problem of genocide, or somehow immune from this contagion. We're not neutral observers here. We are, to varying degrees, implicated in this. So we must respect the hidden forms of violence that may be involved with the otherwise seemingly innocuous question of whether or not any given case is genocide, per se. And to elaborate, teachers may often appeal to the authority of the international legal definition to respond to such inquiries, perhaps without fully knowing the complex legislative history behind the Genocide Convention. We'll discuss that next week when we see how the international legal definition was crafted so narrowly as to avoid any possible charges of self-incrimination. Basically, the final drafters wrote the law in such a way that gave states plenty of room to maneuver. There was a conflict of interest involved with the drafting of the convention, and its definition is therefore suspect. At the very least, we shouldn't be taking it at face value. As a corrective, Reading 5 follows a fresh approach to the field called Critical Genocide Studies, which among other things, works to compensate the disciplinary orientation of genocide studies that has very much been influenced by the strong gravitational pull of the Holocaust, the measure of which has functioned as a sort of means of canonization, determining who or what should be included in this highly exclusive category. The genocide studies canon is thus represented here in this list of cases organized by priority. This basically depicts the attention structure of the field. Those cases that garner the most attention are those that more closely resemble the measuring stick of the Holocaust. The more they resemble, the closer they are to the core of the field. Those cases that don't resemble remain banished to the periphery, where they risk being forgotten altogether. The goal of critical genocide studies is to guard against the inherent symbolic violence that comes with the reproduction of this attention structure. Okay, and that's pretty much it. Let's get started on the discussion forum, where I'd be happy to elaborate upon anything that I may or may not have mentioned here. And like I said, use the learning objectives as prompts for your opening post. Also, don't forget that you need to respond to others as well. Finally, I'll talk about the final project in the coming weeks. Anyways, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.